To start the next session. At the beginning of this year, inspired by the story that Ed and Scott presented earlier about the successful use of latent binding protein in a patient with an RC4 mutation, I decided to try to get the same medication for my patient using the expanded access program, and thanks God I didn't know what it would take. So the purpose of this session, in fact, for all of us to understand better how to navigate through this program. And it's a pleasure to introduce Dr. Sarah Him, who will discuss this program. She represents the FDA.
Okay, am I on? Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay. So we're going a little bit out of order because, expanded access has been mentioned and there are a lot of questions about it. So the goal of my talk, which is going to be very brief, is basically just to walk you through sort of the regulatory underpinning of expanded access, and then we're going to open it up for questions because I know that's a more pressing item for you guys. So let's see. Which one do I push to go forward? The big one?
Yeah, but maybe the
other one. Oh, is there another one?
No, there's no other one.
Oh, it moved. Okay.
Now you have to go back, which is the small.
Okay. All right. Thank you. All right. Sorry about that. This is a standard disclaimer, which says basically, even though I'm from FDA, my presentation is my personal opinion and may not represent the FDA's opinion. So I want to start at the basics, and that is and it may be a little bit too basic for some of you, but basically, if a product has not yet been approved in the U.S., it's considered an investigational drug, and so administration of the product is regulated under the Investigational New Drug Application regulations. So these INDs are submitted by the sponsor of the IND, who's proposing the investigational use of the product. That can be pharmaceutical companies, it can be individual investigators or physicians, it can be academic institutions or a consortium. An IND starts off with maybe one protocol or more, but basically it's a description of how the investigational product is being proposed to use in humans, how safety and sometimes efficacy will be monitored. Safety is the main requirement. But the IND can also contain multiple protocols. So if somebody has an open IND, sometimes you can add an expanded access IND protocol under that IND. So what is the main purpose of expanded access? Basically, it is to allow treatment. So it's when you have a patient you think is appropriate for a certain investigational drug. The drug's not available, there's not a clinical trial available for that patient, but you really think that patient needs it. Expanded access is the route for that. But the main goal of expanded access is treatment of a certain patient or a group of patients. So, and as I mentioned, it can be proposed as a separate IND or as a protocol under an existing IND. So there are regulatory requirements. I think Rashmi said I don't understand regulators at all. And basically, to understand a regulator, you sort of have to understand that we're applying the regulations. So if you understand the regulations, then maybe you'll understand regulators. Unfortunately, the regulations are written by lawyers. So, basically, there are several regulatory requirements for an expanded access protocol or an IND, and that is the patients have a serious or immediately life-threatening disease with no comparable or satisfactory alternatives. I put the CFR citations there for you in case you want to look it up later. Providing expanded access will not interfere with development of the drug for the expanded access use. The third requirement is the patient cannot obtain the drug under another IND or protocol. For example, if there's a clinical study being studied under drug development and the patient might be eligible for that study, because we want to be able to support clinical studies for drug development. And then finally, just so you know, IND regulatory requirements also apply to expanded access INDs. That means IRBs, informed consent, annual reporting requirements, that kind of thing. They also apply to expanded access INDs. So there are several expanded access categories, and I think most people are familiar with the individual patient or emergency use INDs, and then treatment protocols. What's new is the expanded access for intermediate-sized patient populations. So I'm going to talk a little bit about each of these categories. So for an individual patient, and this can be for either emergency or non-emergency use, this is typically sponsored by a licensed physician for their patient to get access to an investigational drug. One new thing is that there's a new form, a 2-page form, Form FDA 3926, which summarizes the information needed. And supposedly, this is going to be a lot more user-friendly than, okay, great. So Scott has personal experience with that. So there's that new form, which is specifically for individual patient expanded access. And then you need a letter of authorization from the pharma sponsor of the investigational product, informed consent and institutional review board approval. And then unless emergency use is requested and granted, the waiting period for a new IND is 30 days, like a typical IND. If it's emergency, you can start sooner, and we don't wait 30 days to tell you that you can start. If by chance you're submitting an individual patient access protocol to an open IND, then there is no waiting period because that IND is already open. That IND has to be for the same product, but it doesn't have to be the same protocol. Investigator responsibilities and IND application reporting requirements, again, are the same as for regular INDs. Now, what is intermediate-sized patient population? And this is a typical regulatory answer, but unfortunately, I don't have a better one for you. It's more than one and less than widespread. Yeah, I know. It's very unsatisfactory. But so basically, it's sort of the in-between between a treatment protocol, which is typically sponsored by a pharma company or a big institution, and, say, an investigator who might have more than one patient who's appropriate for a certain investigational use. So there are certain scenarios where these were envisioned to be more useful. That includes if the investigational drug is not being developed because a disease or condition is so rare that a clinical trial would be impractical. A scenario where the investigational drug is being developed and studied, but patients needing expanded access use are unable to participate in the trial because they don't meet inclusion-exclusion criteria, for example. And then also if the investigational drug was an approved drug that is no longer marketed for safety reasons or is unavailable due to failure to meet the conditions of the approved application. So as you can see, all of these mean that the expanded access use doesn't have to stop when the drug is approved. It just has to be not interfering with drug development for that product. And again, the IND requirements apply. So finally, widespread treatment use or treatment IND, this has been available for a long time. Unlike the other scenarios, here the investigational product must be under active development in pursuit of marketing approval for the expanded access use. So you won't get a treatment IND unless you're developing it for that use. The drug must otherwise have been or is being investigated in a controlled clinical trial. There is sufficient clinical evidence of safety and effectiveness to support the expanded access use. The classic scenario is where a drug is kind of being prepared for submission to the agency, but you want to treat new patients for that use, and that's what a treatment IND protocol would be ideally used for. So just to summarize, the main objective of expanded access is to enable patients to use an investigational drug and try to remove barriers for that individual patient's use of that investigational product. But we still don't want that kind of use to interfere with clinical investigations that could support marketing approval. And there's nothing really magical otherwise because IND requirements still apply. And you still need the cooperation of the pharma sponsor of the investigational product to provide you product, to provide letter of authorization, et cetera. So, all things considered, if what you're trying to do is get data to support marketing approval, it kind of doesn't matter whether you get it through expanded access or through an IND, but you have to have a lot of planning. You have to understand sort of how do I get the data to help support an efficacy and safety determination? How do I do it systematically? How do I do it so that the clinical meaningfulness of the data is very interpretable for the people who are going to be reviewing the data later? And so I would say that, whether you do this under the expanded access route or the investigational new drug, a standard application doesn't really matter to us. But we want to make sure that the information is as high quality and as interpretable as possible. It doesn't necessarily have to require large numbers of trials or patients. So, when we approved anakinra for NOMID, finally, it was based on a very small number of patients. There were 11 controlled patients, maybe 20 patients overall. We've also approved, a number of programs for CAPS based on very small clinical trials, maybe 25 to 30 or 40 patients. So, we're not trying to make the regulatory process overly burdensome, but we do have some regulatory requirements we have to meet when we're determining whether substantial evidence of efficacy and safety have been met. So we think ideally the goal for any of these things should be to help support marketing approval because as Gina mentioned, what do you do with those patients once the drug's been approved and then, insurance companies don't want to cover the drug and the pharma sponsor may not want to continue the expanded access protocol indefinitely. So we always think that, trying to get systematic data is better and hopefully get the drug approved for these products. And I think that's, for these patients. There's a bunch of information on the web. There's a surprising amount of information on the web, actually. These are just some of the links, and hopefully you can get those links. The amount of information might actually be a little overwhelming. So if you have questions, Rashmi has my email. I'll try and help you as much as I can. And I think that's it. So I'll take questions if any of you have them.
Can I ask a naive question?
Sure.
So an IND, is that always for a specific single indication?
No. So an IND is for a product. Practical logistical things, sort of, if the IND is in a completely different, for an indication that's in a completely different review division, sometimes we ask for a separate IND because it's just for ease. It's a completely different set of reviewers. But there's technically not a regulatory requirement for a separate IND for every indication. So that's a good question. I do not think we have a publicly available database of expanded access INDs. I think the company sponsor of the investigational product's probably the best person to ask about that because it's their information to give. We have a lot of restrictions on what we can tell the general public. I don't know how long it takes to get to clinicaltrials.gov or what the circumstances are around that.
If you can put the clinical trials on clinicaltrials.gov and that is public information, then why is the expanded access information the kind of only...
It might eventually go there. I don't actually know the answer to that because we don't relay the information to clinicaltrials.gov, so it's just an information black hole for me. I'm not quite sure who figures that out.
So I just think it's a gift that these clinical trials are usually multi-center, whereas expanded is sort of localized to maybe a center of excellence conducting this, or say a few individuals.
Right.
I think it's a gap because obviously we don't have, as pharma, a responsibility to put that on clinical trials.
Okay, so there is not a requirement. Okay. So I guess maybe it's patchy.
Expanded access, maybe those are not, I don't think so. But ours, for example, is there's no requirement to paying to use clinicaltrials.gov.
I mean, that's something that I could look into raising with the folks who sort of are in charge of doing the clinicaltrials.gov connection, and maybe we can talk about how to make that more of a requirement. But,
Can I ask a question as a parent?
sure.
Because people talk about getting drugs approved when there's not enough data, but the parents can push or the patients can push the FDA to get something approved. How does that work? Like, there's some data out there, and that data is maybe not done by pharma, it's not done by industry, but the parents or the patients really push the FDA to say, I'm going to try that drug, or we need to get access to that drug. We have a physician or facility that's willing to do it.
Mm-hmm.
How does that all play out? Like, does the insurance company or the provider pay for the drug? When the FDA approves that, is the insurance company, supposed to pay for it?
You're asking a lot. You're asking a lot of practical questions, very practical. So it is very, very, very difficult to pull off an expanded access if you're not getting the company involved, because they're the owners of the investigational product. So hopefully you'll be able to use whatever mechanisms you have to communicate with them and work with them. I will say that don't forget your Congress people. And Congress has a lot of bad rap these days, but when Congress people get behind certain diseases or certain causes, they have enough connections that a lot of times that helps to make things move. We often get congressional inquiries, FDA does, so that helps to at least make us think about it. You can also just sort of mass email everyone who might be involved in it, and hopefully try to get somebody to pick up your cause. I know Dr. Woodcock, who's our center director, is very responsive to folks talking to her about the need to get access to treatments. So, there are a number of options. In terms of charging, that's a whole different ball of wax. There isn't a possibility of an IND, investigational use, where the sponsor can charge to recoup the cost of the product. FDA is sort of involved in the process, but the price setting is a very complicated sort of situation. So that is a special circumstance where the sponsor is trying to recoup the cost of expanded access of their product. A lot of sponsors just actually do it for free. But it's, it kind of depends on, I think, the company and, how much leeway they have for that kind of work.
I brought this up with you earlier, but in going through the expanded access process for my son to get this drug, which Dr. Trump spent months of work, our realization was that it was actually the FDA part was not the hard part.
Mm-hmm.
What was
The hardest part was the
Getting the company.
lawyers, the lawyers of my hospital and the lawyers of the pharmaceutical company.
And you didn't find the IRB to be limited as well?
No. That actually was extremely supportive, and actually they sent me a person who was very well trained. It was really the fight between the lawyers of my hospital and the lawyers of the company.
And the company was basically, I think they're nervous that if anything happens, they'll be blamed and that they won't be able to go to clinical trials. So, kind of putting back my business person's hat on, I kind of looking at the situation, I realized it's all about the motivations of the company. And, you know, you are dependent on them. And they really do not have an incentive. Yeah. I mean, what is their incentive to really give you, apart from just being kind and generous? And also, like in the process, I mean, there's real problems there in them spending time and money on expanded access cases when they could be devoting those same resources to clinical trials. So it's not just that there's no incentive, it's that there are disincentives for them. And so you can have, you know, you can have patients wanting drugs which they're willing to take the risk. You can have doctors who think that there's a rationale. You can have all that. You can have an FDA that is willing to support. But it's really a problem of incentives. And that is where the FDA does need to step in. I mean, like, there's a whole thing about clinical trials and what, you know, you make money, the data from. But like, couldn't the data from expanded access feed into clinical trials in some way so that if they do find positive cases, maybe that's not direct support of efficacy, but like, it's something?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned that it doesn't really matter whether it comes from expanded access or a regular IND. It depends on the quality and interpretability of the data. So yes, definitely we can use data from expanded access. But so, for example, the data that Dr. Behrens presented about that patient who received IL-18 BP, I mean, clearly the drug worked for that patient, right? And so that would be partial evidence of the drug working. It's maybe 100% evidence of the drug working for that patient. But then when we're trying to make the decision of whether to approve the drug or not, there are all sorts of questions about how do you identify the right population? Do we really have enough information to know about the risk-benefit in a wider group of people? That kind of thing. So yes, definitely the data acquired from individual experiences is not thrown away. It's not useless, but it may or may not be adequate on its own. I don't know that actually gets the risk that the companies take when they do these things. And perhaps, Shepard or I'm blanking on your name, I'm sorry, Christina, can discuss that a little bit more from their perspective. It definitely is a risk. I would say that FDA, in general, would not say, oh, that patient with Candle died of BK viremia, therefore we won't approve baricitinib in general. But I can see where the companies are worried about that, because you wouldn't, if you saw BK viremia in a bunch of RA patients, then you'd be a little worried, right? That in general, I don't think we would hold it against the company, but you could see how people would be worried about the specter being raised, right? Yeah.
So maybe more of a comment, but maybe for everyone in the room to respond to. So using the IL-18 product as an example, because that's a controlled situation where we've at least got the same pharma company, but 3 different experiences, right? So there was an experience at CHOP, an experience at Cincinnati, and an experience at NIH. What strikes me actually is that the holdup was different in all 3 places. So it sounds like for Alexi, the holdup was, lawyers fighting each other about probably a CDA or something, right?
Right, exactly.
Injury language was the holdup? Was it injury language that was the holdup?
Yes, indeed.
For CHOP, that went like instantaneously. But the holdup for me was my therapeutic standards committee, who was just like apoplectic about the fact that I might write for a drug that wasn't on our formulary. And that was, just, anyway. And then for Scott, so it sounds like his problem was the IRB at the NIH, right? So
we basically, I went through probably 2 months. It eventually fell through because it took so long to get the protocol. What ended up being an entire, it was as much work as writing a from soup to nuts protocol, because I had to put in basically a 6-month plus monitoring plan with benchmarks and standards and who's going to be reliable for which data, and it had every aspect of a full IRB proposal. And the FDA just said, you need IRB approval. Well, my IRB said, and I had to write a supplementary consent that was about 4 pages and went through 5 iterations. Like, And like, I'm not awful at writing these things. In fact, like Cheryl Taylor said, I did a really nice job, but it was, it was many months. And at the point that we finally had IRB approval, the patients were on to something else.
So I mean, actually, the fastest part for me was the FDA, right? I mean, I said that story. It took 3 hours. It was like, I've never dealt with an agency that took 3 hours to do something. So, in some sense, actually, so what can a patient advocacy group do? I mean, in some sense, it's maybe educating hospitals and IRBs and therapeutic standards committees. And how do we, we're really good at dealing with the common things. Asthma, CHOP can whip that out in a second, right? But, oh my God, NLRC4, So I don't know that we locally are great at doing orphan disease, and I think that kind of, the local infrastructure seems to be the holdup, but it's different in each place, right?
It was an emergency case, yeah, so it went, it was like, that wasn't.
You'll notice that, the FDA hasn't been pulled up in any.
No.
Right. And in every case, even though we weren't going to submit an emergency IND, I had every faith that the turnaround wouldn't have been 30 days. It would have been actually quite quick. Because at least, informal discussions, they felt like as long as the IRB feels like the process is safe and the company is on board, you're the physicians, you are taking liability and you know how best to treat the patients, and they're going to be supportive.
Right.
There is sort of the tautological question of how can you ever do a expanded access IND that doesn't have some risk of hurting a drug development. And I think for a drug company, you're always thinking about, we're going to give this drug that we have never given to a child. A child who's been in the ICU in 6 weeks. If she gets fungemic and dies, of course that goes on our investigator's brochure and has the potential to affect drug development. So that part of it has always seemed a little bit inconsistent to me because there's no way of giving an investigational drug that doesn't have that risk. And certainly the companies, as you're nodding, are calculating that as part of whether they're going to approve or not.
Well, I have a pretty wide experience on compassion use, not only for what is normally, which is, let's say, it's a spin-off of the university, so it's nothing yet it's not a pharmaceutical company, but also for big pharma, as I used to work for big pharma as well, and as an investigator, because I was that as well. I think there are a number of responsibilities that have to be shared, and there's a free, as it is for many other things. There's the responsibility of the people who develop the drug that have to be extremely transparent with the treating physician to say exactly what the drug can and cannot do to their knowledge. Very important. I think for me it's very important to explain what needs to be monitored from a safety standpoint. It's not efficacy that is important, because the worst case scenario doesn't work. Right. But the worst case scenario is the drug causes a problem. And that's why I would be always not in favor of proposing a drug in compassionate use unless that's being at least modestly defined the safety profile. That for me is very important, because otherwise we take a complete unknown risk. Complete unknown. Then there is the responsibility of the investigator, who actually takes over the responsibility and the liability of using the drug. It's not the company. It's the investigator at the site that signs, and that's why there's got to be an insurance covered by the hospital, right? In my experience, I never had for the drug for which I had to approve or not a compassionate use, I never had a problem with regulatory agencies. Even in countries, and I can certainly speak for one in Europe, at that time had not approved our study, yet a number of investigators asked us to use the drug, to the point that one day I pulled up and say, look guys, what can we do? We cannot do a trial on behalf of, these are problems. But otherwise, and I must say, not because they're here, Richard, excuse me, but you didn't approve but the FDA for people with HLH has always approved compassionate use in a matter of hours, always. I can only support that. But it's really a shared responsibility. And what worries everybody is to make sure that the investigator reports safety. That is very important. And also because if something happens, the company needs to be able to explain that that was not a problem, or it was. But But it has to be very clear that there's got to be a little bit of a treatment protocol.
Sure, but just to understand from the sort of seat of the potential investigator as a parent, you know, you hear about something in the pipeline, is this going to work for my kid? Understand that if you go to your clinician and say, can you submit a compassionate use IND for this, you know, that's practically a couple months of full-time job with all the reporting requirements of a regular IND, and there's no funding and there's no support for that.
Why do you say 2 months? I don't understand.
Because I mean, because if you submit to the IRB, they have to wait for the IRB meets once a month. A couple weeks later, you get
but you have another. I'm sorry. I have a different experience, including many of the hospitals that are represented here. And the IRB, whenever there is an emergency, like the FDA approves in a minute, they have an emergency.
But the criteria for an emergency IND are fairly strict. It has to be.
Well, if the patient requires the drug immediately because he or she is experiencing a life-threatening event, that is going to be approved. For chronic disease, that's a different story. That's why it's
important. That's
what
we're talking about.
I understand, but then you know, things have to be, you know, put into context. So it's not in general this analogy.
So for instance, probably like in my case, the IRB wasn't the holdup because I was able, as you pointed out, to get the emergency IRB. But I can promise you that I bet if I had to go through a regular IRB, it would have been, because I deal with my IRB all the time, right? It would have been 2 months of banging my head against the wall. And
this happens for every drug.
Yeah, no, but so it's just
not
what are the
only for
holdups?
compassionate use.
No. That's right. But it's just, you know, just because I think your question is what are the holdups, right?
Right, but I was able to do that because I was a federal employee who you know didn't have the clinic schedule that I will, and it still resulted in nothing because it took so long to go through. So you know, if we're talking about the barriers here, that's one of the barriers is that.
So what how do we address that question? I mean, so in one day it would be a central hub that does it. It's already set up, so I'm not even going to have to read it.
So I mean, if the company already has an IND that you can jump onto, and there's an IRB of record for that IND, maybe your hospital would cede to that, but probably they would.
I just want to mention because one important thing: IRBs are, in general, the bodies that delay the most approval of any trial. I tell you. So if you're talking about obstacle to get drug to patient, there are two things. One is IRB, much more than regulatory authorities. And I can tell you, I have the numbers because we see it. And the second thing is contract negotiation. Okay? With I must say, the requests that are just to the roof. We start negotiating at, say, so the first request is 100 to go down to 20, just to give you an example. And this can take up to 1 year. So this is the responsibility. This is the real ask. And I tell you, you know, thanks God I have people do it for me because I would go ballistic if I was something.
So I mean, as a foundation, you know, if you're wondering, like, well, why can't we just try this in my kid? No. It's not.
So having just written an IND, not for an emergency IND, and having had the support of an academic core, it's still really a learning curve. And if we could have support with IND bootcamp or whatever it is, the first time you write one, it's going to be hard. And it's even more burdensome if it's not a clinical trial and you're not doing it for multiple patients, but you're just doing it for a single one. So if patient and parent groups want to get involved, support that doesn't exist in academia to turn over those kinds of things is a major place you can learn support.
And it's not just a learning curve, because every patient's different, every protocol is going to be different. Someone's got to write it. And even if it's two patients.
I have a question about, are there precedents, are there companies or institutions or centers of excellence that, so like with the IL-18 binding protein trial that will hopefully move forward in the near future, like is it wise as that trial is starting to go ahead and have an expanded access IND in place, you know, with company support obviously, so that when these cases arise that this patient doesn't meet criteria for enrollment or they're too sick to enroll in the trial, that you have this option already pre-made. So are there companies that will support this in general or no?
I mean, I would imagine that there would be. I think it's very individual company specific.
But do you see that very often or no? It's usually individual patient INDs or IND.
Do you have an expanded access ID program for?
No, and I am very against something like this at the very beginning of the development history of the drug. We don't have enough information. So companies are really struggling. We're trying to do as much as we can. There's one study that is running, and I think it's very important not to create illusions, but to gather the right data. Let me tell you, I'm going to talk about this in a minute. Dosing. We cannot throw out a patient just because we are desperate. A drug that we don't know how to dose, we don't know how to monitor. So I do believe in expanded access a lot, but it has to happen when the right information is in the hands of the physicians and the ones who are going to regulate the use. Because otherwise it's very dangerous. It's really, really dangerous. So it's not that we can open an expanded access the day a company, opens an IND. Then why a company should open an IND? Then we let the study.
It shouldn't short-circuit a study.
I will say,
Short-circuit the right study.
Of course.
Yeah.
I think most of the time when we start seeing expanded access, it's when the company is already in phase 2 at least.
I think we should move
Usually.
on. Richard,
Or 3.
I'm sure you want to hear your opinion.